Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to d2. Pawn c7 to c5. Knight g1 to f3. Pawn c5 takes d4. Knight f3 takes d4. Pawn e6 to e5. Bishop f1 to b5, check. King e8 to e7. Knight d4 to f3. Pawn a7 to a6. Bishop b5 to d3. Knight b8 to c6. Castle kingside. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight f6 takes e4. Knight d2 takes e4. Pawn d5 takes e4. Bishop c1 to g5, check. Pawn f7 to f6. Bishop d3 to c2. Pawn e4 takes f3. Queen d1 takes d8, check. Knight c6 takes d8. Bishop g5 to e3. Pawn f3 takes g2. King g1 takes g2. Knight d8 to c6. King g2 to h1. King e7 to e8. Pawn f2 to f4. King e8 to d8. Bishop e3 to b6, check. King d8 to d7. Rook f1 to d1, check. Bishop f8 to d6. Bishop c2 to f5, check. King d7 to e8. Bishop f5 takes c8. Rook a8 takes c8. Rook d1 takes d6. Pawn e5 takes f4. Rook a1 to f1. King e8 to e7. Bishop b6 to c5. Pawn b7 to b6. Rook d6 takes c6, check. Pawn b6 takes c5. Rook c6 takes c8. Rook h8 takes c8. Pawn h2 to h4. Pawn g7 to g5. Rook f1 to e1, check. King e7 to d6. Rook e1 to d1, check. King d6 to e5. Rook d1 to e1, check. King e5 to d5. Rook e1 to d1, check. King d5 to e5. Rook d1 to d7. Pawn h7 to h5. Rook d7 to e7, check. King e5 to d6. Rook e7 to e4. Pawn f6 to f5. Rook e4 to c4. King d6 to d5. Rook c4 to a4. Rook c8 to b8. Pawn c3 to c4, check. King d5 to d4. Pawn h4 takes g5. Rook b8 takes b2. Pawn g5 to g6. Rook b2 to c2. Pawn g6 to g7. Rook c2 to c1, check. King h1 to g2. Rook c1 to c2, check. King g2 to f3. Rook c2 to c3, check. King f3 takes f4. Pawn h5 to h4. King f4 takes f5. Rook c3 to f3, check. King f5 to e6. Rook f3 to e3, check. King e6 to f5. Rook e3 to e5, check. King f5 to f4. Rook e5 to e4, check. King f4 to f3. Rook e4 to e3, check. King f3 to f4. Rook e3 to g3. Pawn a2 to a3. Rook g3 takes g7. King f4 to f5. Rook g7 to g2. King f5 to a6. Pawn h4 to h3. King e6 to f5. Pawn h3 to h2. Rook a4 takes a6. King d4 takes c4. Rook a6 to h6. Rook g2 to f2, check. King f5 to e4. Rook f2 to e2, check. King e4 to f3. Rook e2 to f2, check. King f3 takes f2. King c4 to b3. Rook h6 to h3, check. King b3 to a2. Pawn a3 to a4. King a2 to b2. Rook h3 takes h2. King b2 to c3. Pawn a4 to a5. King c3 to d4. Pawn a5 to a6. Pawn c5 to c4. Pawn a6 to a7. Pawn c4 to c3. King f2 to f3. King d4 to d5. Rook h2 to g2. King d5 to c6. Rook g2 to g7. Pawn c3 to c2. Rook g7 to g6, check. King c6 to b7. Rook g6 to c6. King b7 takes c6. Pawn a7 to a8, promoting to queen, check. King c6 to c5. Queen a8 to c8, check. King c5 to d4. Queen c8 takes c2. King d4 to d5. Queen c2 to e4, check. King d5 to c5. King f3 to e3. King c5 to d6. King e3 to d4. King d6 to c7. King d4 to d5. King c7 to b6. Queen e4 to d3. King b6 to b7. Queen d3 to c2. King b7 to b6. Queen c2 to c6, check. King b6 to a5. Queen c6 to c5, check. King a5 to a4. Queen c5 to c4, check. King a4 to a5. Queen c4 to b3. King a5 to a6. Queen b3 to b4. King a6 to a7. Queen b4 to b5. King a7 to a8. Queen b5 to b4. King a8 to a7. Queen b4 to b5. King a7 to a8. Queen b5 to b4. King a8 to a7. The game is a draw.